When we think about comic books, we're normally thinking about superheroes who save the day. We usually think about our favorite heroes found within the DC and Marvel mythos. And we usually think about characters who stand for peace, justice, and freedom, like Superman or Captain America. But when we take a step back and look at the origin point for many of our favorite heroes, we discover they played a major role in both justifying and funding one of the biggest war crimes of all time. So join me in this video as we take a look at To start, let's go all the way back to the beginning, 1940. Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, two Jewish-born Americans, worked together to create a comic book known as Captain America. In the first issue of this series, we get this iconic cover. A cover that shows Captain America smashing fascism by punching Hitler in the face. And it makes sense. Two Jewish guys saw what Hitler was doing, and they hated the guy so much they wanted to make a comic book showing Hitler getting rocked. But what's even more interesting about this book is that it came out March 1st, 1941. Now, if you're a history buff, you'll know at this time World War II was ongoing in Europe, but the United States was not directly involved. So why did they do this? What purpose does it serve showing an American soldier punching Hitler in the face when America had yet to commit any troops to the war? Well, it's simple. It was propaganda. While public polling was a relatively new concept, there was a lot of data that showed prior to America's entry into World War II, many Americans didn't want to go to war. For example, according to the National World War II Museum, a poll from June 1940 showed that only 35% of Americans were in favor of risking war to help the British. Truth be told, I can't find anything that specifically states if Jack Kirby and Joe Simon were pro-US involvement, but the idea of creating a fictional American soldier who resolves one of the greatest wars of all time in just one punch speaks volumes to what they might have believed was the right path to take. And it resonated with a lot of Americans. Captain America issue number 1 sold close to 1 million copies. That's 1 million people walking around reading a story about an American soldier ending the Great War in Europe before we had any troops on the ground. Whether it was Jack Kirby and Joe Simon's intention or not, this undoubtedly had subconscious effects on the American psyche. Because when you read stories and see images that invoke a sense of nationalism during wartime, it bolsters people's enthusiasm for war, basically making it so that the first ever appearance of Captain America also served as a potent piece of political propaganda. So if anyone complains to you these days about comic books being too political, just point to Captain America issue number 1 and tell them comics have always been political. What's also interesting though is that a lot of these Captain America comics don't just promote war by showing Captain America fighting Nazis, they also show Captain America fighting the Japanese. And the way Jack Kirby draws Japanese people, I'm gonna be completely honest, it's incredibly racist. Japanese folk was shown to have barbaric features like beady eyes and massive fangs. They were shrouded in East Asian mysticism and made to look disgusting. This helped enforce a sense of alienation and otherization towards Japanese folks that made it easier for Americans to justify killing them, but we'll get more into that later. All you need to know is that prior to the United States sending a single troop into Europe, we had several issues featuring Captain America fighting Nazis and cartoonishly freakish Japanese people. And these comics were seen by thousands, if not millions of people. And then of course on December 8th, 1941, the United States enters into World War II and the comic book space changes forever. Remember those racist characterizations of Japanese people you saw in those early Captain America comics? They became even more prominent. You got Superman saying slurs, Wonder Woman confronting yellow people, and Batman doing this, all in the name of American exceptionalism. And of course, whenever our favorite heroes clashed with a Japanese person, that Japanese person was shown to look as grotesque as possible. And it wasn't just comic books that were doing this. The first ever appearance of Batman on the big screen, which is also the second ever televised appearance of a superhero was a TV show that showed Batman fighting a Japanese sabotage ring in Gotham City. So, of course, Japanese people were not portrayed very positively in that film. You had Batman and Robin saying slurs, and the lead antagonist of the movie was a white actor in yellow-faced makeup doing a cartoonishly offensive accent. But why was racism so prominent? The reason for that was because alienation was key to justifying conflict. When you frame the opposing group as outsiders or threats to social order, it makes conflict more legitimate. Americans were casting Japanese people as fundamentally different or dangerous, hence legitimizing instances of aggression towards Japanese folk. But this type of otherization didn't just help Americans feel more comfortable about war efforts. It also helped normalize extreme instances of discrimination on the domestic front. On February 19th, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This gave the government the ability to forcibly relocate people who were deemed a threat to the United States government. This law would result in the relocation of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, 80,000 of whom were second-generation American-born citizens. The majority of these people had absolutely nothing to do with the Japanese army. They were law-abiding citizens who had never been to Japan and spoke perfect English, but they were stripped away from their homes and their belongings. They were taken away from their work, their friends, and even their families and put into camps solely because they were not white. Over 5,000 children were born in these camps, and almost 2,000 people died during incarceration. I want you to picture this for a moment. Imagine being stripped away from your home and being forced to live in what is essentially a gated prison for 40 years for absolutely no reason other than the fact that the people we're supposed to hate look like you. It's a horrifying thought, but when it happened, white Americans didn't question it too much. And a big reason for that was because these Americans were fed propaganda. Propaganda like the kind we found in comic books. Propaganda that alienated and otherized Japanese people. Propaganda that made Americans view Japanese people as nothing more than savage monsters. That way, when the American government takes these people away from their homes, no one bats an eye, because the only portrayal Americans had of Japanese people was the kind that shows them to have devilishly yellow skin with long and deadly fangs. And it's crazy to think that our favorite heroes, Captain America, Superman, Wonder Woman, and Batman, all played a role in normalizing this type of thought. But why was this? Well, one important thing to recognize is that during wartime, there were rations in place. This meant consumers could only buy a limited amount of products. But this didn't just apply to private citizens. Companies like comic book publishers also had to ration key goods like wood pulp and sugar, essentially making it so that comic book companies were capped in the amount of books they could publish. Enter the Writers' War Board, aka the WWB. The WWB was a privately run organization that collaborated directly with the government, making the WWB a quasi-government organization. The goal of the WWB was to serve as a bridge between writers and the government to make sure that for-profit fiction would ultimately serve to aid the government's war efforts. In short, the WWB was a domestic propaganda organization. They set guidelines for how to portray the war in fictional stories. A key philosophy that the WWB supported was the stark racialization of America's enemies. And here's the kicker. If your comic was approved by the WWB, there was always a chance that your company could be granted access to excess ration goods. So, if you're a comic book publisher and you want to mass publish a book, approval from the WWB would play a significant role in your success. So, we think back to these racist characterizations in Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman comics, and it starts to make more sense why they would consistently otherize Japanese Americans. It's because these books were state-sponsored propaganda. But there's also one other element of propaganda that comic books engaged in, and that was the way comic books promoted the sale of war bonds. If you're unfamiliar, in World War II, war bonds were debt securities issued by the United States government to finance military operations. They were a way for the government to raise funds while encouraging citizens to support the war effort financially. And you best believe the WWB incentivized companies to promote the sale of war bonds in any way they could. That's why, if you look at the cover of comics from that time period, you'll see a lot of our favorite heroes standing next to American troops, telling you that it's your duty as a patriot and American citizen to buy a war bond and help the country. But as mentioned, the money raised from war bonds would go towards military projects like the Manhattan Project, a top secret research and development program during World War II that created the first atomic bombs that would be dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 6th and then August 9th, 1945, this attack caused unprecedented devastation, instantly killing over 100,000 people and leading to tens and thousands of deaths from radiation exposure, burns, and long-term illnesses. The attack left both cities in ruins, with citizens suffering lifelong physical and psychological trauma till this day, making it one of the darkest moments in human history. And our favorite heroes played a role in letting this happen. Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman were used to reinforce racist stereotypes about Japanese people. These stereotypes in turn contributed to a lack of American empathy towards the tragedy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But on top of that, the promotion of war bonds in their comic book covers directly funded one of the most horrific war crimes of all time. I wanted to end this video with a little bit of an anecdote. I actually host a lot of panels in my area where I talk about this exact topic. During one of my panels, at the end of the presentation, this guy in the back raises his hand and he goes, "You know, I know a lot of Japanese people. They're very tough people. There's an argument to be made that Japanese people wouldn't have surrendered if we didn't drop the bomb on them." And in that moment, I was absolutely dumbfounded. I had no clue what to say. I'm not gonna lie. From a personal point of view, I don't think it's okay to kill innocent people, period. But for some reason, this guy is thinking to himself, we were justified in killing innocent people because it ended the war. I don't want to get into this hypothetical argument about what may or may not have happened, but I do know one thing. The type of rhetoric he was using is the same type of rhetoric that was used after the dropping of the bombs to justify war crimes. This guy was touting propaganda that's almost 100 years old and doesn't even realize it, which is absolutely insane to me. And that's why I think it's always important to be cautious and careful with the type of media we consume. Back then, people did not know that they were consuming propaganda. Audiences didn't realize that the Writers' War Board was incentivizing comic book companies to make racist books. Audiences didn't realize that the sale of war bonds would lead to one of the most heinous war crimes of all time. And audiences didn't realize that the racist characterizations of Japanese people they saw was a big way to normalize internment camps domestically. People just thought they were losing themselves in fictional stories about their favorite heroes, which is why media literacy is such an important skill. Sure, this example is from World War II, but that doesn't mean it can't happen again. A lot of the time, we don't realize we're being propagandized until it's too late. Thank you guys for watching the video. Hope y'all enjoyed. Make sure to subscribe, like, and hopefully I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.